Our theme this month has been Good Includes Prosperity. And today's topic is healthy, wealthy, and wise. That probably sounds familiar to you. I think it was Benjamin Franklin who coined that phrase. And like most sayings that have come down through the years, it's been amended somewhat to fit any given moment, or a Sunday talk, as it turns out. So, in fact, what Benjamin Franklin actually said was, early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. But old Ben might have had a little bit of judgment going on there, that going to bed early or getting up early are not the only, even the major criteria for becoming healthy, wealthy, and wise. And of course, we would add to that somewhat limited purview that women can also be healthy, wealthy, and wise. So now that I'm on a roll on enhancing Benjamin Franklin's sayings, let's explore some other ways that we apply the principles of successful living to health, wealth, and wisdom. There once was a rich man who was near death. And he was very grieved because he had worked really hard for his money. And he wanted to be able to take it with him to heaven. So he began to pray that he might be able to take at least some of his wealth with him. An angel heard his prayer, his plea, and appeared to him saying, "Sorry, fellow, but you just can't take it with you." And the man implored the angel to speak to God and be in his behalf, to see if maybe the rules could be just bent a little for him. In the meantime, the man continued to pray that his wealth could accompany him. The angel finally reappeared and informed him that God had decided to allow him to take one suitcase with him. It's like the free suitcase on the airlines now if you have the right card. So man was particularly overjoyed at this point. He grabbed his largest suitcase, needless to say. He filled it with pure gold bars, and then he placed it right next to his bed. And sure enough, soon afterward, he died. But when he showed up at the gates of heaven, St. Peter, seeing the suitcase, said, "Hold on there, fella. You can't bring that in here." So the man explained that he had permission and asked St. Peter to contact God and verify the story. St. Peter checked, and sure enough, he came back to say, "You know what? You're right. You are allowed one carry-on bag, but I'm supposed to check its contents before I let you through." So the man set the suitcase down and opened it up to display his gold bars. And St. Peter's evidence was St. Peter's curiosity was evident as he looked and he wondered what earthly items this man had found too precious to leave behind. And so he peered inside the suitcase. Pavement? St. Peter said, "You brought pavement?" Think about it. What are the streets of heaven paved by, according to the stories we hear? Gold. So what else do we drag through life with us that we covet, that we hoard, that we never let it work for us? How often are we neither healthy or wealthy because we haven't been very wise about caring for ourselves? And when we don't care about ourselves first, inevitably we discover that we cannot care for any others, no matter how much we'd like to. I've recently been rereading a book. You'll see that it's got some age on it. titled The Richest Man in Babylon. This was written by George Clayson a number of years ago. And though it's rather time dated, and it's set in Babylon, which no longer exists by that name, it has some great concepts in it that speak to us about the very ideas of being poor, of being weak, and of being unhappy that don't do any of us very much good. Consequently, we can't be much good to anybody else either, can we? The wonderful other gift that I received from rereading Clayson's parable is on the back page of the book, but then it's small, so you can get to the back page pretty quickly on this one. It's an advertisement for a book by Napoleon Hill, which reminded me that I hadn't read Hill's Think and Grow Rich for quite a while. So I pulled that classic out, also pretty time-worn, and began to reread it. And I'd like to share some of his incredible ideas with you today. He is so timeless. People still read this book. People still quote him. And Napoleon Hill was inspired by Andrew Carnegie. And he wrote this book in the early 1900s, but its truths still survive and still flourish with every new generation because they're timeless and practical. And as you may remember, Andrew Carnegie had been extremely successful in building and maintaining an empire that was not only financially comfortable for him, but that employed hundreds and even thousands of other people who then also benefited from the expansion of his ideas and his beliefs. Napoleon Hill interviewed over 500 wealthy men about their secrets to becoming wealthy, as well as noting the ones that Carnegie shared with him, as Carnegie became the steward of a fortune valued at over $100 million. And that was in the early 1900s, folks. If you were to apply inflation to that, I think you'd find some more zeros added to that for sure. But it's important, I think, for us to realize that truth is truth wherever it's found. We don't have the corner on that market in Science of Mind. Instead, we work in order to have the wisdom and the receptivity to acknowledge it wherever we find it. So here are some quotes from Napoleon Hill. Skipped a page, sorry about that. Let me catch up here. Riches begin in the form of thought. The amount is limited only by the person in whose mind the thought is put into motion. Faith removes limitations. Here's another one of his quotes. Every adversity, every failure, every heartache carries with it the seed of an equivalent or a greater benefit. Next quote. You have absolute control over but one thing, and that is your thoughts. This is the most significant and inspiring of all facts known to mankind, humankind. It reflects your divine nature. Your mind is your spiritual estate. Protect it. Use it with care. Now, if I hadn't told you who those quotes were from, you'd probably be thinking, oh, maybe Ernest Holmes, perhaps Wayne Dyer, probably Eckhart Tolle. Maybe even Michael Beckwith, if you're a fan of Michael Beckwith, who has the International Center in Southern California called Agape. So in Think and Grow Rich, Napoleon lists 6 ways to turn desire into gold. And by gold, he means wealth, riches, or those things which you value for any of a number of reasons that may be personal, that may be material, that may be in any of a myriad of different expressions, including but not limited to bars of gold. So first, Napoleon says, fix in your mind the amount of money or treasures you desire. It's not sufficient to just say, well, I want money, or I want lots of money, or I want lots of possessions, or I want lots of friends. Be definite as to what you mean by amount or depth of value. And add that to your wonderful metaphysical caveat. So he's saying in intention, be clear. Second, he says, determine exactly what you intend to give in return for the money, the possessions, or the connections that you acquire. So what he's talking about there is what we call this law of circulation, giving and receiving. And it doesn't have to be in kind. You may receive money and give service. You may receive someone's services and give something that you know that you truly value in the way of a possession, and you give it to them because you love it and you love them. And then third, Hill says, establish a definite date or time when you intend to complete that which you desire. Now, for most of us, when we do that, we throw ourselves into doubt that we can actually make it manifest by that time. One of the ways to really deal with that is to say, by the end of the year or sooner. And then let Spirit describe and display that to you in such a fashion that you build your acceptance for it. Fourth, create a definite plan for carrying out your desire. And begin at once, he says, whether you think you're ready or not, to put your plan into action. Create a definite plan for carrying out your desire. The first thing I would say on that plan, if I were making it, is be open to receive. So that I am ready to accept it right here, right now, because truth of the matter is, it's already in mind right now. It's in your mind, which means it's in the mind of God. The manifestation of it is your acceptance of it. So it's already here. The only thing that awaits you is your acceptance of it. So this is really important, to have a definite plan. Oh, maybe someday in the future when I'm more spiritual, or I'm older, or I'm not so busy, or whatever. And when we do that, we put legs on it to allow it to run the other direction. So it's really important for us. When we put it into mind, be ready to accept it. You know it could be there as soon as you open your eyes. So fifth, Napoleon says, write out a clear, concise statement of what it is you intend to acquire. Part of the reason for this is sometimes we forget what we said, such that when it shows up, we don't recognize it. So I would suggest that you do that prior to the time you make the statement, as long as you add to it this or something better. And then 6, take a look at what it is you put into mind that you wrote down. Take a look at it once or twice a day. Maybe before you go to sleep at night, maybe when you first wake up in the morning. And as you read, see and feel and believe yourself already in possession of it. You see, he was talking to businessmen and entrepreneurs about money, and yet the principles that he was using are the very ones that we use as we work with spiritual mind treatment and other spiritual practices in order to bring into our lives not only money per se, which is fine, and many other things as well. And then Napoleon points out that this process he has delineated calls for no hard labor. It requires no sacrifice. It doesn't even require a great amount of education. But it does call for what he calls imagination, and what we refer to in science of mind as intuition, creativity, and developing a mental equivalent. So you see, you can take these languages and you can really work with them to see how similar they are in various expressions, but they all work the same way. And it does require that you actually believe that you will possess or attain or recognize this coming into your life, just as that is true where your health and your well-being is concerned. If you don't know what health looks like, how will you recognize it when it appears? Napoleon Hill cautions against what he termed the disaster of negative thinking. See if this quote doesn't sound familiar to you. The subconscious mind, he said, makes no distinction between constructive and destructive thoughts. Where have you heard that before? Well, starting with page 52 in the Science of Mind text and repeating itself again and again and again. Then he goes on to say, our mind works with the material we feed it through our thought impulses. Like the wind, which carries one ship east and the other ship west. The law of suggestion will lift you up or pull you down, according to the way you set your sails of thought. And if you have ever sailed, you know exactly what he's talking about how you use the wind to move your boat through the water in two different directions, even though the wind is blowing one way. So once again, reading these ideas of Napoleon Hill is just like reading the Science of Mind text in a lot of ways. But then that's because we have that basis of understanding of how to use these ideas. So here's a poem that I found in Think and Go Rich. Those of you who have read it will probably remember this poem, but it's a wonderful reminder. If you think you're beaten, you are. If you think you dare not, you don't. If you like to win, but you think you can't, it's almost certain you won't. If you think you'll lose, you're lost. For out in the world, we find success begins with a person's will. It's all in the state of mind. If you think you're outclassed, you are. You've got to think high to rise. You've got to be sure of yourself before you can ever win a prize. Life's battles don't always go to the stronger or the faster man, but sooner or later, the one who wins is the one who thinks he can. Napoleon Hill was also very clear that these principles work in all areas of life. He said, the riches within your grasp may not always be measured in money. Oh yeah, how about that? The wind is having a good time with my talk this morning, so bear with me. Even I have to adjust to that breeze. So there are great riches in lasting friendships. There are harmonious family relationships, sympathy and understanding between people, and inner harmony, which brings peace, measurable only in spiritual values. These are Napoleon Hill's words. He was very clear that our state of mind in one area of our lives carries over into all areas of our lives. So the principles that we use to improve our financial life can also apply to our health, our work life, and in relationship with those we love, or vice versa. That the principles that we use for good health in our work life and in relationship with others carries over into the principles used to improve our financial life. Hill says, nature wraps up in the impulse of strong desire that something which recognizes no such word as impossible and accepts no such reality as failure. You might be interested to know that there's a chapter in this book on faith also. It begins with the quote, "There are no limitations to the mind except those we acknowledge. Both poverty and riches are the offspring of our thought." Then he goes on to say that faith is the head chemist of the mind. Isn't that an interesting phrase? Faith is the head chemist of the mind. When faith is blended with thought, the subconscious mind instantly picks up the vibration, translates it into its spiritual equivalent. These are the words of Napoleon Hill in the early 1900s, folks. His word sounds familiar to us today because it's so similar to so many other incredible unfolding consciousness levels in the world during that time. He goes on to say the subconscious mind translates thought into its spiritual equivalent and transmits it to infinite intelligence. In the form of a prayer. So here's a financial entrepreneur who has learned from the likes of Andrew Carnegie, Charles Schwab, Thomas Edison, J.P. Morgan, F.W. Woolworth, Henry Ford. Here is a man who looked at the road to riches in virtually every corner of development of this country. Here's a man who sought out and defined what he called the secret to making money. You know, he looked for it from the time he was a child of 8 years old. And he found it. And he said unabashedly, when faith is blended with thought, the subconscious mind instantly picks up the vibration, translates it into its spiritual equivalent, and transmits it to divine intelligence in the form of prayer. Pretty cool, huh? Then he goes on to say that faith is a state of mind that may be induced or created by affirmation or repeated instructions to the subconscious mind through self-suggestion. So, as you can see, there's a wealth of information and ideas in this little book. I mean, sometimes we have books that are really big, have a lot of long words we don't even recognize. Some of us have to read some of those books with the dictionary right alongside of us, or Google turned on so that we can immediately go to it. Fascinating, just fascinating. I could talk about it for hours, but I don't want to put you to sleep or put you into food deprivation. But it's worth a read if you've never read it, for sure. And if you haven't read it for a while, you might want to revisit it. It's like an old friend. So if you're interested in bettering your financial position in life, or your health, or your education, or your love life, or your personality, whatever you choose to make better for yourself, you might consider taking a look at that book. I hope this morning's ideas have given you some ideas about the correlation between prosperity and spirituality in our world. My wish for each of you today is that you become as healthy, wealthy, and wise as you can possibly be. That's really up to you. Each time you walk through the door of this spiritual center, my wish is that you bring those attitudes of prosperity with you so that we can all enjoy them by being in your presence and by hearing your standing in the light discussions of the successes that you've had. And as your consciousness grows and expands in these ways, the health and the wealth and the consciousness of this center, individually in each of you and collectively as a center, grows and expands as well. As Holmes frequently reminds us, through right thought and right belief, we can greatly influence our environment, its reaction to us, the situations we meet, and the conditions we encounter. We look away from conditions which now exist if they are displeasing to us, and we accept better ones. And for those of you who were here last week and heard the sharing of one of our Standing in the Lights, where one of our people was attending an event which was very disturbing to a large number of people, and the first thing our member did was to step to one side and do spiritual mind treatment on behalf of the individual who could use it. And the reports this week are very good, where that individual is concerned in the healing that's being experienced. So you see, that's how you can contribute. That may not sound like much to you. That's extremely powerful when you are able and willing to do that. So you can choose to be healthier today than yesterday. You can choose to be wealthier this week than last week. And you can choose to be wiser in this moment than the last moment. You can make certain that each day's prayer treatment includes those affirmations as each day you think and grow rich in your life. And so it is.